Hi guys, welcome to the channel. I'm the Jacobian Dev, and in this video I'll be going through how to create an Autodesk Forge viewer using React. I've opened my CMD and I'll start by changing directory to the desktop. Next, I'll navigate to the Create React App documentation. I've added a link to the documentation in the description. I'll select on Get Started. I'll be using the npx method to create the React app. I'll copy the Create React App method and paste it into the CMD. I'll change my app to Autodesk Viewer and press Enter to create the app. It takes a while to complete, but once that's done, I'll change directory into the newly created Autodesk Viewer. I'll then open VS Code and navigate to the Autodesk Viewer directory. First, there are a few packages that need to be installed. I'll navigate to the Material UI site. I've added the link in the description. I'll copy the packages, and back in VS Code, I'll open the terminal to install the packages. I'll also install the Material UI Icons package. Next, I'll install Axios and the classic version of React Router DOM. Once that's done, I'll navigate to the package.json file to view the installed packages. Next, I'll navigate to the app.js file. This is where the routes will be added. Before I add the routes, I firstly need to add the authentication for the viewer. In the source folder, I'll add a pages folder, and in the folder, I'll add a file named Auth. Here we need to create a function to get the access token from the backend server. I'll start by importing Axios. Next, I'll declare an async function named getAccessToken. The function will send a GET request to the backend URL, which will be added later. The function will also return the response data. I'll then catch any errors and log them to the console. Lastly, I'll declare a client constant and equate it to the getAccessToken function. I'll then export client. Next, I'll create a home page in the Pages folder. I'll start by importing React and component from React. I'll then import the app bar, the toolbar, typography, the icon button, and the button from Material UI. Next, I'll import the menu icon from Material UI Icons. I'll then declare a new home class that extends from the React component. I'll then declare a constructor and pass props as a parameter. I'll also declare super and pass props to call the constructor of the parent class. Next, I'll call the render method and return a div with a class name viewerHome. Next, we need to add the Material UI components. I'll navigate to the Material UI documentation and search for app bar. I'll view the code for a simple app bar. I'll copy the app bar code, and back in VS Code, I'll add it to the viewerHome div. Next, I'll change news to Jacobian Dev and login to update. This will be the button to update the door finish value. Lastly, I'll export the home page. Next, I'll navigate to the app.js file. I'll delete the app function and logo import. I'll then import React and component from React. I'll import browser router as router. Switch and route from React Router DOM. I'll then import the home page. Next, I'll declare an app class that extends from the React component. I'll call the render method and return a div, which I'll wrap in a router. Inside the div, I'll add a switch component. I'll then define my route component, specifying the path and setting the component to the home page. I'll save the changes, and in the terminal, I'll run the app. I'll navigate to the browser, and here we can see that the app bar was successfully created. The next step would be to add the Autodesk Forge viewer. I've added a link to the documentation in the description. I'll navigate to the documentation page. I'll scroll down and select Viewer Documentation. Under Viewer Essentials, we can find the documentation to add a viewer to an HTML page. I'll copy the style sheet, and back in VS Code, I'll add it to the index.html page in the public folder. I'll then change the viewer version to 7.0. I'll also copy the script and add it to the index.html page. I'll also change the version to 7.0. Make sure the style sheet and the script are the same version. Next, I'll add a viewer page in the Pages folder, and in the folder I'll add a viewer functions file. This is where I'll create all the viewer functions. I'll start by globally importing Autodesk N3. Next, I'll import client from the Auth page. I'll also import Axios. Next, I'll declare a new getToken variable, which calls the client getAccessToken function. I'll then declare a viewer variable. Next, to add the viewer, I'll navigate to the documentation and select on Initialize Viewer. Here we can find the code required to create and initialize the viewer. If we take a look at the initializer functions docs in the API reference under Viewing, we can find all the parameters required to initialize the viewer. Back in VS Code, I'll declare a launch viewer function that requires the div and file earn as parameters. I'll call the getTokenAccessToken function, which will return the token once resolved. I'll then declare the viewer options. I'll set the environment to Autodesk Production. I'll then set the access token to the token's access token. Next, in the documentation, I'll copy the function to initialize the viewer and add it to the launch viewer function. We need to pass the div to the HTML div variable. I'll replace Forge viewer with the div parameter. Next, back in the docs, I'll select on Load a Model. I'll scroll down to putting it all together and copy the code. Back in VS Code, I'll add it to the launch viewer function. The document ID should be equal to the earn parameter. The function to load the model requires two callback functions, one to load the model and the other to catch any failures. Next, I'll add the viewer page. In the viewer page, I'll start by importing React and component from React. I'll also import the viewer functions we've just created. Next, I'll declare a new viewer class. I'll then define the render method that returns a div. I'll define the div style. I'll set the position to absolute, the width to 100%, the height to 85%. I'll then set the ID property to viewer div. Lastly, I'll export the viewer class. Next, we need to get the document ID or file earn so we can view the model. For that, we can use the Autodesk Forge Tools extension by Peter Bros. I'll go to the extension settings and edit the extension's JSON file. Here we need to add the Forge client ID and client secret. To do that, we need to sign up to Autodesk Forge. Once you've signed up, the next step would be to create a Forge app. I'll select Create Application and name the app React Viewer. Once the app has been created, you can view your client ID and client secret. I'll change the callback URL to the front-end URL. I'll then save the changes. You can also select which Forge APIs you want the app to use. Back in VS Code, I'll navigate to the Autodesk Forge Tools extension. To get the file earn or document ID, we first need to create a bucket. I'll create a bucket named React Viewer. I'll select Transient. We can then view the newly created bucket in the Forge Tools toolbar. Next, I'll upload a model by selecting Upload Object. I'll select the CloudDB Revit model. I'll accept the changes for the name of the model. Next, the extension uploads the model. Once the model has been uploaded, I'll proceed to translate the file. By selecting on the uploaded model, we can track the translation process. Once the translation is done, we can view the model by previewing the derivative. Next, I'll copy the object earn. Then back in the viewer.js file, I'll declare the component.mount method. Inside the method, I'll declare a new document ID variable, which will be the object earn I just copied with the prefix earn. I'll then call the launch viewer function from the viewer functions and pass the div ID as the first parameter and the document ID as the second. To get the access token for the viewer, we need to call the getToken endpoint from the server created in the previous video in the series. I've added the link in the description. I'll open the Mongo Server project and create a new credentials.js file. I'll add the credentials schema, which is the credentials object that defines the app client ID, client secrets, and scopes. In the authentication docs, we can find the scope values. Next, I'll navigate to the server.js file. I'll define a credentials constant. I'll use the fs module to check if the credentials.js file exists. If true, I'll import the credentials.js file. If false, I'll log to the console, no credentials.js file present. Next, after the routes, I'll call the app-get function and pass token as a route parameter and the callback function as a second parameter. I'll then call the request post method, passing the credentials authentication URL as the first parameter. For the options, I'll pass a form using the credentials defined in the credentials.js file. I'll then define the callback function, passing error, response, and body as parameters. If there isn't any error, and if the status code is 200, I'll get the response from the GET request as a pass JSON body. Lastly, I'll run the server by calling node server.js. Back in the React Viewer front end, I'll navigate to the viewer functions and export the launch viewer function we defined earlier. In the Auth.js file, I'll add the backend URL to get the access token from the server. Next, I'll navigate to the home page and add a bottom margin to the app bar. I'll then import the viewer and add it just below the app bar. I'll save the changes, and back in the browser, we can see that the model was successfully loaded. Next, we need to get the door finish values from the database and map the ID to the doors in the viewer. For that, I'll use the geometry loaded event, which fires when the model finishes loading. I've added a link to the documentation in the description. Back in VS Code, I'll navigate to the viewer functions file. I'll add a geometry loaded event listener just after loading the model. The event listener requires an onGeometry loaded callback function. I'll then proceed to define the onGeometry loaded function. I'll then define a viewer variable from the event target. Next, I'll remove the event listener to avoid memory leakage. I'll then call the viewer fit2view function to fit the model in the viewer. Next, we need to get the DB IDs and external IDs of the elements in the viewer. To do that, I'll use the getExternalID mapping function that returns an object with key values being node IDs and keys being the element's external IDs. Back in VS Code, I'll call the getExternalID mapping function from the viewer model. This returns a callback function with the object data. I'll call the Axios get function to get the Revit.data from the MongoDB server, passing the backend server URL. After getting the door data response, I'll declare a new door info variable, which will be equal to a new map constructor. Next, I'll iterate through the response data. I'll then call the object keys method, passing data as a parameter. I'll then iterate through each key. I'll check if the key, being the element's viewer external ID, is equal to the server's door external ID value. If true, I'll set the door info key to the door's external ID value and the value to the door finish value. Next, I'll iterate through each key value pair in the door info map. I'll then declare a switch statement with the first case equal to Saturn. I'll declare a new 3-vector 4-color variable named blue. If the door's finish value is equal to Saturn, I'll set the door color to blue, passing the external ID and color as parameters. Next, I'll copy the case statement a few times. I'll then proceed to change the case values to the door finish value options. I'll also change the corresponding colors. Next, I'll catch any errors from the get function and log them to the console should there be any. I'll also catch any errors from the get external ID mapping method. I'll save the changes, and back in the viewer we can see that the doors have updated with the door finish values. The next step is to add the update functionality to update the door finish values. I'll start by adding a few dialog imports. Next, in the Material UI docs, I'll search for dialog. I'll scroll down to optional sizes, and here we can find a dialog with a select form control, which is what we're looking for. I'll copy the code for the dialog, and back in VS Code, I'll paste it in the home page. I'll proceed to modify the dialog. I'll change dialog title to door finish update. I'll change dialog context text to please select door finish value. I'll change the select value to door finish. I'll also change the input label to door finish. I'll add a save button to the dialog actions. I'll also add a door finish label to the select. I'll set the menu item label and value to Saturn. I'll copy the menu items and change the values to the door finish value options. Next, I'll declare the state in the constructor. I'll set the open variable to false and the door finish variable to Saturn. Back in the render method, I'll call the open and door finish values from the state. Next, I'll declare the handle close function to close the dialog. That sets the state of the open variable to false. I'll then declare the handle change function to handle the selected door finish values. The function sets the door finish value to the event target value. Next, I'll declare the handle click open function that opens the dialog. The function sets the state of the open variable to true. Next, we need to create a get selection function to update the door finish values in the database. I'll navigate to the viewer functions page. I'll declare a get selection function, which I'll export. and requires the door finish as a parameter. First, I'll get the DB ID of the selected item by calling the viewer getSelection method. I'll check if an element is selected by calling the viewer getSelectionCount method. If not, I'll show an alert stating select door element. If there is an item selected, I'll call the viewer getProperties method, which requires the element's DB ID and returns a callback function with the item's properties. I'll declare a new data object variable. I'll set the ID property equal to the item's external ID. I'll then set the door finish property equal to the door finish variable. Next, I'll call the Axios patch method, passing the backend update URL as the first parameter and the data as the second. The method returns a callback function with the response. I'll show an alert stating that the door finish value has updated. I'll then reload the page. I'll catch any errors and log them to the console should there be any. Now back in the home page, I'll import the getSelection function from the viewer functions. I'll then add it to the Save button's onClick handler. I'll then navigate to the browser and select a door element. I'll click on the Update button and select a door finish. Next, I'll save the selection, and when the window reloads, we can see the door with the updated door finish value. That should be it for this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I've also added the link to the GitHub repo in the description. Please also do like, share, and subscribe.